those of you who may not be familiar, we publish the Data Breach Investigations Report every year, and I've actually been publishing it now for 16 years. Really kind of trying to dissect and understand what the threat landscape looks like from a variety of different angles. And for those who may not be familiar with me or my role within Verizon, for those of you who might think of Verizon as the phone company, obviously that's a big piece of what we do. But we've been doing cybersecurity now for over 20 years. And I manage a team of consultants that operate all around the globe. We also do managed security and all that kind of stuff. But the point of that is we help a lot of organizations manage through difficult cyber times. They will call into our cyber SWAT team for help whenever there is some kind of incident or breach or suspected unusual activity. And the genesis of the report that we created, and I've got a handful of them up here, hard copies. There's not a lot of them, but I've got a couple. I'll save them to the end for Q&A, so the first few people who ask questions will get hard copies. But the genesis of it really stemmed from organizations wanting real data to describe what the threat landscape looked like in order to be able to design their controls and make sure that what they're doing from a cyber perspective is actually addressing the problem. Because historically, it's something that most organizations would see or hear a headline of a breach, but actually understanding how that breach occurred was usually a bit of a kind of nebulous gray area. And so you see here 16 years of data, 81 countries represented, so we try to make it as global as possible in terms of where we source the data from. And then you see two big numbers on there, the incidents and the breaches. And for those who may not be familiar what the difference is between those two, the way we kind of break it up is incidents, kind of think of that as an alert or an alarm has gone off. We need to do some type of investigation and actually figure out what has transpired. Maybe someone has broken through a defense, but they maybe haven't gotten access to some type of sensitive data yet. Whereas the breaches are where it's actually gone to that next level and we know that sensitive data has been compromised, and it's now just a matter of how much and how we manage, say, the disclosures or the mitigation measures of that. So there's a lot here. I'm only going to cover a couple of elements of this slide, and I'll get into a little bit more detail as I go on. But a couple of key takeaways that we've seen, and actually maybe one area where we've actually seen a little bit of improvement that's worth highlighting is around the human element. The last time we published this report, the human element played a role in 82% of all breaches. 82%. This year, we dropped down to 74% of all breaches involve the human element. Now, I like to look at that as at least a little bit of a win, but it's still 74%. It's a gigantic number. So there's definitely some room for improvement there. And obviously, there's a lot that we see tying back to things like social engineering and otherwise, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail on as well. The large majority of the cyber attacks that we see are financially motivated. It's around smash and grab. It's how does the threat actor get into an environment, steal data, and typically steal data that they can go out and sell, typically on a deeper dark web market site. And so it's all about converting it to cash. And it's interesting because we work a lot with law enforcement. In fact, many of the law enforcement agencies are contributors to the research that we do. There's about 70 or so contributing organizations that give us their incident data as well to combine into the research report that we put together. And when we have the opportunity to work with law enforcement on things like prosecution of some of these groups, it's interesting when we have the opportunity to actually see what it looks like in their operation, when their equipment is actually seized and analyzed. And in some cases, we may even be the organization that actually helps law enforcement analyze that evidence to figure out what has transpired and maybe find some of the other victims that maybe have been targeted by the same organization. And what we'll see is that most of these cybercrime groups, they operate like a business. They try to figure out what targets to hit based on what's going to make them the most money, what's going to be the least effort, what's going to be the lowest risk of getting caught. So it's kind of interesting to see that operation. And then the other side of the coin is kind of more of your espionage, maybe more nation-state motivated threat actors, which are typically after things like intellectual property and trade secrets. Every now and then we'll see nation states kind of delve into the area of, say, sabotage and destruction as well, but it's typically single-digit percentages that fall into that category. Then you also see their pretexting rows. Pretexting was a big piece of what we've seen in the last year. For anybody who may not be super familiar with what that is, it is essentially tricking an organization into doing what you want them to do by pretending you are someone else, typically pretending you are someone in a position of authority. And oftentimes, this might take the shape of someone sending you a message saying, hey, we need to pay this invoice. It is already 90 days late. We need to get this done right now. And they will purport to be the CEO or the CFO or someone like that. And so people will see it and go to take action very quickly. And what's really interesting about these kinds of attacks, they're usually very simple to conduct. They're not overly sophisticated types of events. But what's interesting is many times the victim doesn't realize they've been victimized because they think they're getting a message from somebody legitimate. They think they're following legitimate instructions. And so typically it's not until sometime thereafter that they even realize they wired $1 million or $5 million or whatever the case may be to somebody who should have never received it at all. So it's kind of another interesting way of looking at the way the threat actors are going after the targets. And we'll talk about some of the other stats here in a moment. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the pattern of activity that we see. So in the earlier slide, I mentioned both incidents and breaches. And here you see the incident patterns. It's kind of a bunch of wavy lines. Maybe looks like something that my kid drew with crayons. But trust me, there's real data behind all those numbers and lines and where they go. And what this highlights is kind of the trend over time in the change of that incident pattern landscape. And there's different groupings based on how we see the incidents take shape. So for example, you see the big one in the last year in the incident category was denial of service, which is typically just, hey, it's an impact to availability. You overload someone's system resources, applications, such that essentially legitimate usage gets locked out. And one of the things I think is interesting when you look at the incident patterns here is that denial of service is probably one of the most easily mitigatable forms of incidents that is out there. There's a tremendous amount of denial of service mitigation services that exist on the market that actually would help you thwart most of these types of attacks, yet we still see so many of them happen. So there's an element here where I think organizations can maybe prioritize this a little bit differently depending on what their exposure is to these kinds of attacks. But if we look at the breach patterns, you see somewhat of a different view. You notice that denial of service is completely off the chart. Maybe off the chart's the wrong word to use. It's not on the chart at all, is what I mean. And what I mean by that is we don't typically see denial of service attacks that actually result in the loss or exposure of sensitive data. It's typically just about availability. So when you actually look at the chart, you'll see that the top category of breaches, the ones that typically loses the most data, are going to be things like your system intrusions. And then followed behind that are going to be web application attacks or attacks against APIs and things like that. And then typically you'll see social engineering and other forms of attacks that will follow behind that. And you always see a little bit of movement in these lines over the years based on either how the threat actors are modifying their attacks, upskilling, bringing on more resources, or kind of compare and contrast that with the way that defense is maybe changing up some of their tactics as well. So I mentioned social engineering earlier and the fact that the human element has played such a substantial role in what we see. And this chart really just shows you a number of different ways in which we see social engineering manifest. And you'll notice, for example, that phishing typically tops the chart, and then pretexting, and there's a whole host of categories of social engineering. But pretexting jumped all the way to the top in the last year based on just the fact that it was just trivially easy to fool people into giving up either access or financials. And so that's ultimately what we saw happening in this particular pattern. And we also saw the median that they would use, or the medium that they would use to conduct the attacks, varying more broadly. The majority of the attacks would typically be conducted over email, but we're also starting to see that expand to being over things like SMS, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, pretty much any kind of messaging application as other ways to try to get someone to be fooled and click on a link or follow a certain set of instructions. And it's interesting because we always look at this from the standpoint of user education and awareness, which I think is a very important piece. There's also a technology component to all of this as well in terms of how we do the detection, the blocking and tackling. And I'll share with you a quick story of a situation that we had worked on where this was a CISO who was telling me about how they had done so much work on their user education and awareness, and they were thrilled to see that most of their people were doing really well at reporting the phishing emails when they would come in, not clicking on the links. It was great. Until one day, a phishing email came through. They blocked it. They managed to make it such that the link couldn't work. They had the site taken down. Someone clicked on it. They got the error that they couldn't access the link. Great. But then the person replied to the phishing email and said, hey, the link to the promo you sent me doesn't work. Can you check it? And the threat actor obviously was fantastic. This is great. Sent a new link back to the person, which they then clicked on and then gave up their credentials. So you can imagine that there's a lot of kind of the social engineering that goes into it in terms of how this works. And so sometimes it's not just about the monitoring or blocking of the link, but sometimes it's just the out-of-band communication that goes on as well. So we see a whole host of ways in which this typically takes shape. Ransomware is another category that's interesting because it's the first time that we actually saw it really kind of stabilize, if you will, after kind of a really substantial rise over the course of the last several years. In fact, if I were talking to you about ransomware this time last year, the story I would have been telling you then was we saw ransomware rise more in that 1 year than we saw in the prior 5 years combined. Now compare that with where I am right now and tell you that it's stabilized. Now, the thing that I think is an important takeaway here is it's stabilized at the high watermark. 24% of all breaches are related to ransomware. So there's still obviously a lot of work to do, and obviously what we want to be able to see is start to see that chart start to fall off and come down. Now I think part of the reason why it's actually stabilized is, you know, if you think about ransomware, it had gone through a lot of evolutions. It started from a point where it was mostly about just locking up your systems and your data. Then it moved into other forms of exploitation or extortion where the threat actor would actually steal copies of the data and threat to expose it. And so it's changed a lot over the course of the last couple of years. And for a lot of organizations that are on the defense, the challenge they had was they needed to figure out what their mitigation strategy was. And if anybody here, I know many of you here are with large organizations, you know that the path to taking on new defenses is not quick. You don't just decide today we're going to implement the new technology, tomorrow you go buy it, and the next day you implement it. And if there is anybody here who can do it that fast, come speak to me afterwards. I'd love to chat with you. The reality of it is most organizations, they do their due diligence, they vet out a number of solutions over the course of probably months. They maybe do proof of concept testing. Then they go out and get budget. That could take many more months. Then they have to figure out their implementation plan and testing. That takes many more months. So when you look at that chart over the course of the last couple of years, it's not surprising that we were kind of playing catch up for a period of time as organizations really figured out what was their defensive strategy. And so I think we finally reached a point where we've kind of reached that inflection point with the threat actors. But I also think it's worth noting that I don't think the threat actors are giving up. As I mentioned earlier, they're typically out for financial gain. And ransomware and business email compromises are the two fastest ways for them to get paid. Think about the other forms of breaches that typically occur where it's about monetization of stolen data. In many of those cases, the threat actor has to do reconnaissance, figure out a vulnerability, get into the organization, move around, do additional reconnaissance, try to figure out where the sensitive data is. Once they find that data, they then need to exfiltrate that data somewhere, and still, even after all of that, they haven't made a dime on that breach. They still need to take that data to some deeper dark web market to sell it, and they have to find a buyer for it. And believe it or not, I've seen many situations where they will steal so much data that they can't find buyers for it all. Like they'll steal hundreds of millions of records and they can't unload it enough because they have so much data and not enough buyers. And don't get me wrong, I'm not sympathizing with the threat actors and their problems, but the point of it is that when you look at things like ransomware and business email compromises, they generally are gonna get paid very quickly. And I understand that not everybody pays. But the reality of it is for the threat actors, they're just playing kind of the law of big numbers and figure, look, if we hit enough targets, some percentage will. The other thing that we also see contributing to some of these activities as well is the growth of the cyber insurance market. For anybody who's not familiar with that, for the early years of the cyber insurance market, they were largely pitching the concept of insurance to protect you in the event of ransomware. If you were to be hit with a ransom event, your insurance company would step in and take care of paying the ransom and covering the cost of your breach mitigation. And so that was very exciting for a lot of people, and a lot of organizations raced out to buy that insurance as a way to mitigate that concern. And then as time went on and we started to see this uptick in ransomware events, the insurance companies started stepping back and go, whoa, 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 we need to reconsider how we offer coverage, the limits, the premiums, and all of that. But it actually got to such a point where we would see ransomware threat actors that would target a victim and basically give them an FAQ of, if you don't know how to pay this ransom, check with your risk management people because you may have insurance that covers this, which is crazy. But that's to the point that we started to see, and I think that was kind of a wake-up call for some of the industry as well in terms of, hey, we need to start changing the way that we do this. I already kind of mentioned the business email compromise piece, but the highlight here I want to call out is the rapid rise. This is probably the most significant increase that we saw in all of the data that we have in this year's report. And again, a lot of it just stemming from the fact that it's generally very easy to get someone to just go ahead, follow the actions, and typically wire the money. And in a lot of these cases, the challenge is if the victim doesn't know they've been compromised, clawing the money back is that much harder, because you've heard stories of organizations that have been breached. You've heard stories of law enforcement managed to recover the funds, but typically there is a clock on that. And after so much time has passed, as you can probably imagine, the threat actors don't just put the money in one account and leave it there. They typically move it around to make it harder and harder for law enforcement to keep up, or try to move it into a jurisdiction where it becomes very difficult for law enforcement to interdict. When it comes to errors, this is another piece that also ties back a bit to the human element as well, but you'll see a number of different components there around things like misdelivery, misconfigurations. There's a lot of kind of human element components that tie into this, and you'll see the kind of different types of individuals that play a role in it. For example, developers, the biggest challenge we see here is around things like secure coding. A lot of organizations, when we talk with them and the kind of aftermath of an event, we'll usually hear that, look, the development team is positioned to create something, and their KPIs are all around getting something to market quickly and operationally. And security for many still is not one of their KPIs. And for a lot of organizations that we still talk to today, security is something that happens later. It's added on, or it's an overlay after something is already in production. And so the challenge you obviously face there is these applications and otherwise that are getting rolled out have access to a lot of sensitive information. And if the security testing isn't happening until later, we run the risk, obviously, that there is additional exposure. And then you have all the things like misdelivery and mispublishing and stuff like that, where the data is just outright sent to the wrong individuals, or data that should be sensitive and kept internal is made publicly available and people are able to download it and access it. On the web application side, this is another one that continues to plague a lot of organizations. And if you kind of think back to one of my earlier slides where I had all those kind of wavy lines, you'll remember that web application attacks were kind of second on the list of breaches. And typically this is because they have ready access to pretty much every organization's sensitive information. So if you have some kind of web application vulnerability that exists, there's a really good chance that your sensitive data is about 1 or 2 hops away from that web application if that web application itself can't directly access that data. And so typically we'll see this be very heavily targeted. It's also where we'll see threat actors searching out the potential for exploiting things like zero-day vulnerabilities as well. I wanted to mention Log4j, and then also kind of tangentially related to that would be the MOVEit vulnerability, and I'm sure many folks here are familiar with these, but this one is particularly interesting for me. So I sit on President Biden's Cybersafety Review Board, and if anyone's not familiar with it, it's kind of like the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, that's designed to investigate, you know, when there's an airline crash or an issue with a train. They will come in, investigate, try to figure out what happened, and try to figure out how we make the transportation environment safer so people can remain having confidence in it and use it. The CSRB was created about a year and a half ago now with the idea of doing the same thing for cyber and say, look, cyber has become such an ingrained part of our society, our economy, our national security, that the concern around systemic and catastrophic risk is real. And so the government wanted to say, look, from a DHS perspective, we wanted to understand what that risk looks like and how do we improve upon the security of all of our infrastructure. Log4j was one of the first things that the board actually took on an investigation of, and since then, we've now actually done a few others, and we've got another one that just kicked off. If anyone wants to discuss it, I'm happy to chat at a break. But the point of this one was the concern around it being systemic, and the concern that, and if anyone doesn't know what Log4j is, it is a shared library of sorts that can exist in software code. And so in many cases, the way I kind of describe this is, it's like an ingredient in food. If you have an allergy to a particular ingredient, you're very sensitive to what is in your foods, and you're gonna ask and check and make sure you know, because otherwise you could have a really bad allergic reaction. And the concern with Log4j was it was found to be a vulnerable library that existed in millions and millions of applications around the world. And in fact, the challenge also that existed is many organizations didn't even know if it was an ingredient in their application. I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with the concept of software bill of materials, but that's kind of like the cyber equivalent or the IT equivalent of the ingredients list on your food. You know, when you look at a package of food and you see all the different ingredients that are in that prepackaged food, the concept of software bill of materials is do the same thing with applications so that you can know what kind of components like Log4j are actually ingredients in your application, such that in the event we identify there's a new vulnerability out there that has the potential to have real significant consequences, you could quickly look at that ingredients list of all your applications and know where you have that exposure and then put the right mitigation in place. The challenge we found when we investigated this was most organizations never had those ingredients lists. So they didn't know where this ingredient was across their infrastructure, across their applications. And many had to quickly now try and go out, get some tool to go out and try to scour their environment and look for this. And we saw a tremendous amount of scanning just in the first 17 days to try to figure out how much of an exposure existed. And the concern honestly was this could have been the biggest cyber catastrophe the world has ever seen. Thankfully, we're all here today and it didn't manifest in that way. And I have a lot of debates with people about, was it an overblown thing, or was it something where, hey, you know what, the excitement around it generated the right activity to address the problem. For anybody who remembers way back in the day, Y2K, people thought the world was gonna end when Y2K happened. I see a couple of people laughing, and maybe some people weren't around for Y2K, but back then, the concern was it was going to end the world as we know it. Planes were going to fall out of the sky, elevators were going to drop from the top floor, and maybe some of those things really could have actually happened. Nobody knows, because there was a concerted effort over the course of months and years before Y2K because of those concerns to address the problem. So obviously we'll never know. And I think Log4j was kind of the same thing. There was so much, I don't know if I want to say panic and concern, that some of the most critical systems, our most important banking systems, the systems that manage airlines and elevators and all these other things, potentially had vulnerable instances of Log4j that could have made them all susceptible, just like Y2K. And so the entire cyber industry really got together in a concerted way to address the problem like we've never seen before. I've never seen collaboration like this. And in fact, even when we saw the MOVEit vulnerability more recently announced, we didn't see this level of collaboration. And so I think it's maybe a good learning point for us that there's still more collaboration to be done because these challenges are not fully solved yet. I wanted to also spend a moment just on the geopolitical side of things because it has a real nexus with cyber. You know, we think of what's happening on the global landscape, and you know, I've unfortunately been adding to this slide over the course of the last couple of years. It used to be smaller, and it's gotten bigger, and it's gotten bigger because there's more and more conflicts happening around the world, and many of them have a cyber component to them because, as I'm sure everybody recognizes, you can do cyber from anywhere. It doesn't have to be a country-to-country kind of thing, and you can do it via proxies. And so it creates a lot of interesting challenges. And so you look at, say, the Russia-Ukraine data points there. We see a lot of things that are still happening in respect to this. For example, when that first started, there was always e-crime groups that operated out of Russia, but believe it or not, for a long time, the Russian government actually restrained them, would actually hold them back from doing certain attacks or attacking certain targets. That may be a surprising thing to think of now, but back then, before all of this happened, they actually did have restraint. And we actually did have some degree of a bilateral law enforcement relationship where we actually had success in prosecuting criminals. Obviously, that landscape has changed. Those gloves have come off, and now they're doing things that they've never done before, and they're going after all sorts of different targets. And it's a very complex web of political alliances and others that also come into shape here as well, because you can conduct, quote, a cyber war. You can sabotage equipment. You can get into environments and just sit there and wait. And you just wait for the right opportunity to conduct whatever it is, the action that you want to conduct. And so we see more of these kinds of events occurring now than we've ever seen before because the geopolitical landscape is so much more kind of fraught with conflict. And obviously, I can spend probably an entire hour on each of these particular ones, but I wanted to highlight the fact that as a cybersecurity community, we need to be looking more ahead. What is the next thing that might happen and how it is that we might prepare for it. For example, I think a lot of organizations that I spoke to were very unprepared for what unfolded with Russia and Ukraine. Maybe people could see that something was going to happen, but they didn't necessarily know what. And more challenging for many was they didn't know what it meant for their organization. If you were in charge of network or security or applications or operations for your business, and you had operations in that particular geography, what were you going to do? Many never had a playbook for what that was going to be like. And so a lot of organizations struggled in terms of figuring out how they were going to proceed. Next, everyone started looking at, okay, well, if something happens with China and Taiwan, what does that mean? Because from a manufacturing standpoint and a global supply chain standpoint, the impacts there are even orders of magnitude more complicated is probably an understatement. And then obviously what's going on in the Middle East is obviously also very concerning because there is a tremendous maturity of cyber talent that exists there and a tremendous ability for there to be other forms of activities that occur that have a kind of cyber nexus component to them. So now I'll just go through a handful of kind of recommendations and resources that I'll share and then open it up to some questions. One of the things I can never state enough is the importance of cyber hygiene. In most of the breaches that we get called in to help organizations investigate, one of the biggest challenges they face, and this even kind of goes back to what I mentioned before around Log4j, is around asset inventory. It's probably the least sexy part of cybersecurity, but it's one of the most fundamental things. If you don't know what assets you have in your environment, how are you going to secure them? How are you going to monitor them? How are you going to know what a threat actor is doing in the environment. And we've seen countless situations occur where the threat actor will basically just hop from asset to asset to asset, and the organization has no idea they're there because the organization doesn't even realize those assets exist. In one of the recent cases that my team had worked, we did our own asset inventory in the organization because what they brought us was clearly incomplete. After we compared the asset list we generated with the one they provided us, we found 32,000 additional assets in their environment on their network than what they had in their own asset inventory documentation. That's bigger than some entire organizations, and that's just assets they didn't even know existed. Password management, multi-factor authentication, I think I've said this one about 1 million times, and obviously organizations are now starting to also go down the road of shifting towards passwordless or towards things like YubiKeys, all adding additional levels of security around authentication. Establishing an ecosystem of cybersecurity partners, this one's critical. I talk to lots of organizations. Nobody has enough cybersecurity talent. Everybody needs more. If you look online, you see everybody's trying to hire and can't hire and add people fast enough. And going back to the earlier point that I made around collaboration and the importance of it, things like Log4j, we were only successful, in my opinion, with that because of the level of collaboration we had. The fact that so many organizations banded together to address that problem. The more we try to stay in kind of silos, the less likely we're going to be successful against the threat actors, because keep in mind, we have rules we need to play by. There's laws that govern what we do and how we do it. The threat actors don't have any of that, right? Or at the very least, they don't care about that. And so that kind of puts us at a little bit of a disadvantage sometimes. Executive breach simulations is another big thing, and we actually saw the interest in these tick up a lot over the course of the pandemic as organizations started seeing and feeling new types of breach events hit their organizations. The reason why I highlight this is because a lot of organizations, their technical talent is very mature. If you say, look, we're going to shut this down, or we're going to migrate this, or we're going to move to that data center, the technical teams know exactly how to do that. Where we usually see the issues arise is at the executive level. Because when we say, hey, you know what, you need to shut down all the stores, you need to take down the e-commerce site, you need to shut down the manufacturing lines, all of a sudden everybody jumps back in their seat and says, that's like the last thing we can do. But it might be the decision that needs to be made when a breach happens. And so actually kind of gaming that out and walking through what that looks like and say, what are the circumstances where we actually say that's the action that we take? And it's always interesting to me when we do a breach simulation with an organization, usually going in, everyone goes, yeah, everybody knows what they're gonna do. And then coming out of it, you see people like sweating and like, oh my God, I never realized how hard that was gonna be to deal with it. And thankfully it wasn't a real breach, but nonetheless, it made them think about some hard decisions. And then integrated threat intelligence. This one is an important one because I see lots of organizations, everybody will tell me that they have threat intelligence. Everybody will tell me about how much of it they collect. But the challenge that I always give them is, what are they doing to actually integrate it with their environment, to actually make it proactive or even better, preventative, and eventually get to predictive so that we can actually stop events before they occur. Otherwise, what I find is lots of organizations leverage threat intelligence as like an encyclopedia. After an event has occurred, after a threat actor got their data, they leverage the intelligence to figure out who the threat actor was and what they probably did. But at that point, the damage is largely done. Measure what matters. So for anybody here who is an avid reader of the Data Breach Investigations Report, the Veris framework is what we use to create it. We actually created the framework about a year before we created the report because there was no standard kind of scientific way or taxonomy for measuring breaches from year to year to understand what's changing and do it in a consistent manner. So we created the Veris framework. We released it open source. So you can go to that web address if you're interested and you can see all the resources. We make everything available there. Lots of organizations, I think we're probably over 10,000 organizations globally now that leverage the Veris framework internally to kind of create their own version of a DBIR. And we also do a lot of collaboration with MITRE. And then the last thing I'll mention is We also host a monthly intelligence briefing. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Bright Talk platform, but there's some great resources there. The Data Breach Investigations Report is kind of a retrospective looking back on the last year and the trends that we've seen. These are intended to be kind of a more ongoing dialogue where we welcome questions from anybody in terms of what it is that you're seeing, kind of compare and contrast with what our threat intel and our incident responders are seeing. So it's a great way to kind of keep the conversation rolling. And with that, I think we've got maybe about 5 minutes or so for questions, and I have a handful of DBIRs here if anyone has questions.
Hi. What would you expect a threat actor to do when they're, excuse me, focused on an organization as opposed to just throwing out a line, seeing if they get a bite? What would you expect to see from that threat actor? That's focused on your organization, that maybe found something that they're just keep going.
So in terms of they're specifically targeting you?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, so generally speaking, a more targeted attack, I would say if the threat actor is specifically going after you, they're generally preceding the attack with a specific reconnaissance plan. So they're typically looking at who are the individuals that work there. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of activity in terms of, in fact, kind of a new trend emerged around kind of fraudulent interviewing, where we would actually see individuals interview for a job at the company they were trying to target in order to try to get insider access to the organization. Typically, though, to your question more directly, they're typically looking more for intellectual property and trade secrets when they're looking to target the organization on a more direct basis. Now, obviously, it depends on the industry that you're in. For example, if you're in financial services, they may be looking at it from a financial gain perspective. We've also seen in some cases for large organizations, they will target the organization for purposes of getting into their HR systems. I've seen a lot of situations. In fact, there was one, it was a retailer where someone got into their compensation system and they changed the direct deposit information for all of payroll to be deposited into one bank account. So when payroll ran, the entire company's payroll all got deposited into one bank account. And HR and benefits didn't even realize it until the following week because people just thought, oh, there must have been a glitch, it just paid late. And then when Monday came around and people realized they hadn't gotten their paycheck, all of a sudden the HR and compensation hotline started lighting up and people realized, uh-oh, something really bad happened. And the organization actually had to go out and get a bridge loan to cover the money in order to be able to actually go ahead and pay people out their salary while they worked with law enforcement to try to recover the funds. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Heather Noggle, and I love the DBIR. I'm curious why you decided to make it funny.
Why we decided to make it funny? So honestly, it came down to we didn't want it to be dry. Our concern was that if we felt it was too much data, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of charts, but if we felt we didn't have the humor to it, we didn't think that there'd be all that much of an uptake in it. There would be a significant interest from the data science people, but our goal was to really try to broaden awareness around cybersecurity concerns. And we said, look, there's an entire audience out there of non-cyber people that need to understand the importance of cyber. Because at the end of the day, the big challenge we find is if, this may sound odd, but if we leave cybersecurity just to the cybersecurity people, we're never going to solve the problem. Everyone needs to have some skin in the game to address it. And so the point of the DBIR was to say, look, how do we get the application folks interested? How do we get the endpoint folks interested? How do we get the CEO and the finance folks and the HR folks interested? And in fact, what we did even to drive that point home even further was, this was probably, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, we released a companion report to the DBIR called the Data Breach Digest. If any of you want to check it out, you can Google it, you find it, it's still freely downloadable. But it was basically just a storybook of breaches, but from different vantage points. So one breach, the story was told from a cybersecurity person's perspective. Another breach story was told from the perspective of HR or legal or all these different stakeholders. So it was kind of interesting to kind of try to put it in that perspective of other types of readers. Any other questions? We're out of time.
I think, yeah, we are.